This is the California Liberty Project podcast.
So welcome back to the California Liberty Project podcast. I appreciate everyone being here. And we're going to jump right in today because we've got a great guest. I think someone who's got a lot to say, someone whose work many of you are going to be familiar with. And if not, you will be very cognizant of it after today. So my guest is Michael Rectenwald. And Michael is an author of many books, I think 11 or 12 by now. He's also a frequent contributor to Mises and other websites, writes op-eds and opinion pieces all over. You've seen Michael Rectenwald, Dr. Rectenwald, on Tucker Carlson. You've seen him on Fox News, cable TV, all over the place. And also, he used to be a professor at NYU. And I believe Dr. Rectenwald was a professor of liberal studies and some other topics at NYU. He was the notorious anti-PC NYU prof on Twitter. And it looks like he might still be banned. I'm not sure. We could discuss that. But at any rate, he's a man that wears many hats, has a lot of interesting things to say, and I'm really glad to have him on the podcast here today. So thank you very much, Michael, and I appreciate you being here on California Liberty Project.
It's great to be here, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much. So as I kind of mentioned, or at least alluded to, much of your work has been focused on anti-political correctness or the deleterious effects of political correctness in society and in academia, and also kind of the totalitarian nature of the social justice left. And you've had a really interesting journey, I think, in my opinion, just from following your work, from reading a few of your books, and I plan to read more. But your journey initially, I think, was started documenting it in Springtime for Snowflakes, I think from 2018, where you kind of talked about your experiences and maybe a little bit of your political awakening, being at NYU, or just talking about some of the things that had happened to you, that essentially you were victimized intellectually. Was that time for you essentially a jumping off point for you, as far as a political transformation or awakening, or maybe would you characterize that differently coming out of the academia?
There was a lot of transformations going on. Political transformation, indeed. A very big worldview shift, a Gestalt shift in my worldview. And simultaneously some personal issues with my ex-girlfriend, and there was a lot happening at the same time. And simultaneously, my son was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. So there was a lot going on. And I was, as you probably know, I was pretty far left. I was a Marxist. And so, I had a whole shift on that. And I've now become, militantly anti-communist and anti-socialist, and pro-liberty, pro-free, free market, and pro-individual rights. And that's basically been my crusade. And part of it has involved now, it's shifted to somewhat a different register, and to the extent that now I also engage in what I call power elite analysis, and looking at these elites that I think are subversive. So I call them subversive elites. So I've gone from critiquing social justice and what then became wokeness, and then also I tracked that into the treatment of big tech and what I call big digital in my book Google Archipelago, and then sort of put a synopsis of a bunch of essays together in Beyond Woke. And then recently, before this latest book, The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty, I wrote a novel called Thought Criminal. So all these books are kind of like a new stage in my career, beginning with Springtime for Snowflakes and beginning with the transformations that happened around then.
Yeah, and I know that you had written, or at least experienced, certainly, this kind of new moral order, almost like a new left-wing puritanicalism in academia. And I know certain people have talked about, is this kind of a brand new revolution, all this wokeness, all this social justice stuff? Certainly in the academy, I know Orrin McIntyre has said that this is not a new revolution that we're seeing; it's the culmination of an old revolution. Do you agree with those sentiments, or is that just a different way of kind of saying the same thing?
There's elements of the old in it, in the social justice creed, that come from socialism, really. And social justice is a phrase that's been used many times by different groups. I won't go into the whole history of social justice all the way back to the 19th century, but it incorporates those ideas of economic justice that John Rawls wrote about, but then it incorporates new elements that come from the postmodern theory, postmodernism, and also from Soviet and Chinese disciplinary mechanisms that are coming out of the Chinese Cultural Revolution and the Stalinist purges and the Red Terror and the Gray Terror, these kinds of techniques of autocritique or self-criticism and struggle sessions, which are Sino-communist and Russo-communist.
Yes.
So there's all of those elements. That's what I talk about in Springtime for Snowflakes. Where does this come from, and what are the elements that have converged to create all this? It's old in the sense that this is the left doing leftism, and the left's going to left, and they're going to continue to take up the mantle, even if and after the failures of socialism and communism in the Soviet Union, not China. Yeah, well, China's failed too, but they shifted gears, and elsewhere, and still using different vocabulary and different ways of describing the same sort of objectives. And so I think I've documented all that, and we could talk about either the particulars if you want, or go further.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating that you referenced at least kind of the Maoist influenced cultural revolution in China. In many ways, I look back to May, June, and the summer of 2020, the summer of hate, and with all those struggle sessions. Although I didn't see too many people calling them such, white people kneeling and apologizing for this or that, and prostrating themselves. Was that, in your opinion, was that planned? Was that orchestrated, or was this just an example of convergent evolution on the left wing? Is this always where it leads, or were there kind of puppet masters who were forcing these cultural revolution kinds of techniques upon us? And then you had useful idiots who were only so willing to comply.
Yeah, I missed a little bit of that because you're breaking up. So maybe switch into that other mode.
Okay,
but I'm not sure exactly everything you said. I think you mentioned, these techniques that came out of the Soviet and the Chinese.
Yes.
And really also, Italian Marxism with Antonio Gramsci and his notion of cultural hegemony and overtaking the institutions rather than taking on socialist revolution straight ahead, rather than trying to overthrow capitalism immediately, first attempting to overthrow the ideological support for capitalism. And that's been underway for really, I would say, 100 years, really.
Right.
So it's not only Gramsci and the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, it's also, those are major players there that basically inaugurate this new kind of cultural revolution in taking over infiltrating and taking over all these institutions, which we've seen has been almost, I've said it's totally complete.
Right.
This is complete, successful for them revolution, cultural revolution. So then they've begun doing the economic dismantling that piece by piece and incrementally. That's underway now. And the postmodern elements are basically the epistemological subjectivism and relativism that accompanies all this and works for totalitarian ends. I've talked about why they work towards totalitarian ends. It's because when you eradicate the objective criteria for knowledge, then it depends on having power. Basically, knowledge is whatever people with power say it is.
So, Michael, regarding this new moral order in the academy, and you had mentioned kind of this new woke totalitarianism that has really taken root in the past few years or past decades. Can you tell me a little bit more about this? Kind of flesh it out for me. What does this woke totalitarianism look like? And what is it maybe modeled after in terms of previous movements that we've seen?
Well, what it does is it mobilizes and weaponizes so-called fragility or of the so-called subordinated or subaltern or any number of terms that are used to describe these so-called underdogs. And it weaponizes that fragility and uses it against others to police their speech, so that speech is now deemed dangerous to people, and therefore it can be shut down based on the so-called fragile nature of these subaltern others, if you will. And so what it is really, it's a totalitarian regime to silence and disappear anybody that violates a code regarding what can be said and what can't be said, because it supposedly injures other people. This is the basic premise here is that you don't have a right of free speech to express anything that might endanger other people or even insult them, or that they may not want to hear. So likewise, this is a way of abrogating our rights to speech. And it looks like it looks like what it does on Twitter, what it does on Facebook, what it does all over the web. It's just a means of silencing the critics or the really any dissident from the woke regime. And so there's not really that much more to say about it, except that, well, it has some, of course, it borrows from previous regimes like the Maoist Cultural Revolution and their struggle sessions and auto-critique or self-criticism regimes, and it mobilizes those in a new digital realm largely, but otherwise also in the so-called meat world, anywhere really. And we're seeing it used to disappear and get professors fired from academia for any statements that insult or denigrate supposedly these groups. And so these groups are used as means of bludgeoning people over the head, really. They're just weapons. They're not really concerned about the welfare of these people, because when it comes down to it, they would slap these people down as well if indeed they violated the woke precepts and creed.
And so a lot of these students, and I'm not sure if you had seen this in your students, but it's amazing to me, almost this Maoist or cultural revolution kind of nature of what we've seen here, certainly since 2020 and even before that. But a lot of these students who end up imbibing this, let's call it leftism, they almost become useful idiots, and they become some of the most vicious persecutors of the bourgeois or of the traditional or of the unwoke. First of all, do you agree with that statement? And is it something you had seen yourself in your years as a professor?
Yeah, they get mobilized as useful idiots because they don't recognize the real objectives of this creed, which is to destroy the sense, to destroy the contingent of the majority, basically, largely a white majority. But the middling ranks of society are persecuted with this woke ideology, and the idea is to, if we can figure their rights as privilege, then indeed we can take these rights away. I didn't see this with students at all in my teaching at NYU or otherwise. This was really propagated through faculty and administrators. They're the ones that are the watchdogs for this. Students were not, in my experience, too invested in undertaking this, at least at the students that I was teaching. Basically, I didn't give into or play any party to the kinds of concerns that would really rise to the occasion on these issues. For example, I just didn't treat such issues as, the triumvirate of race, class, and gender as major issues in my teaching, unless,
Right.
It was endemic or intrinsic to a text that we were studying. It wasn't always imposing on this text these issues like they do now, where everything is read this way. They impose these kinds of readings on everything, and then it encourages students to start thinking along these lines, and it eventually it starts to envelop all their thoughts, such that they don't have any other ways of even thinking. So this is what happens. It's an indoctrination process, and my classes were taught almost as anti-indoctrination sessions.
So in your opinion, is the left intrinsically or necessarily Marxist? And I know Marxist is a very broad term, and I understand that certainly academically, but is it nowadays really post-Marxist? And I know even 150 years ago there were, or maybe more, I guess there were folks like Bakunin or Proudhon. Some of them, maybe some of them, not all of them, would even have considered Marx maybe reactionary. That's how far left some of them are. But broadly speaking, in your opinion, is the left necessarily Marxist? I mean, I think what we've been talking about, and a lot of your work is obviously discussing this weird post-Marxist, almost postmodern element to what we might broadly lump in as the left. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's been there's been a lot of transmutations of the left since Orthodox Marxism came forth, and it's had a lot of permutations, from championing the working class or the proletariat against the capitalist class, and then with the new left and neo-Marxism, beginning with the Frankfurt School, and then also becoming a hallmark of Maoism. There becomes this new emphasis on basically identity and consciousness. So there's a new champion, a new protagonist for the left, or a new set of protagonists, whereas it had been the working class when they failed to materialize as the revolutionary force in history that Marx had claimed they would be.
Right.
The new left began seeking other protagonists, and they looked for it in feminism and environmentalism, and most recently in LGBTQIA plus new victims, new underdogs, and that brings me to the main theme of leftism. It's not so much that it has to be Marxist, but it has the same ethos, which is what I call underdogism.
Yes.
And that is, it always seeks to find these underdogs and to use them as bludgeons, basically, to bully and destroy the group in question, which is the privileged in this case. The privileged must be vanquished, and they use these so-called underdogs as a means to do so. So the common theme that runs through leftism all the way from Marxism through transgenderism is underdogism. That is, finding these subaltern or subordinated or oppressed groups and championing them against another class, usually privileged or previously under Marxism, the bourgeoisie. So there's certainly some continuity on the left, despite all of these changes that came about with identity politics and postmodern theory and neo-Marxism before that. So yes, there's continuity, but there's certainly a lot of shifts, and they share with Marxism this underlying ethos of underdogism.
Right. Right. And as I talk to you, of course, I'm coming from California. A lot of times this podcast focuses on California specific elements and themes. But here we have a very strange milieu, or very strange stew, if you will, of kind of leftist, kind of left liberal policies, soft authoritarianism, in some cases hard authoritarianism. And where the rubber meets the road in some Western, quote, liberal democracies, democracy, in scare quotes, but where the rubber actually meets the road, it's strange because what we've inherited now is such an amalgamation or hodgepodge of different left liberal, neoliberal, and then some, I guess, cultural Marxist and leftist ideas. We're in a very strange place, I think. I'm sure you've been to San Francisco maybe or LA in recent years and have seen the drug use, the people slumped over in the fentanyl crawl, the defecation famously in San Francisco, the homeless encampments. And I've got to look at our so-called left-wing leaders, as people call them popularly. They're not really leftists, right? There's some kind of left liberal, neoliberal authoritarianism or authoritarians. Yeah. And I've got to wonder, is this the goal? Like, there's never any kind of looking in the mirror. There's never any rear view mirror with some of these left liberal politicians. And it's incredible how the so-called left is always able to escape kind of the consequences of its own broad group of policies.
Its policies are meant to perpetuate the conditions that are then used to justify itself. So they must create and maintain these groups, these underdog groups, these subordinated or oppressed people, so that they can then continue with their policies of supposedly benefiting them.
Yeah.
So they have to produce. That's why you find in the most left-leaning parts of the country the worst crises of poverty and homelessness and drug abuse and drugged homeless people, basically encouraged to undertake their drug use by needle programs and hospices and all kinds of means by which they encourage actually the very behavior that's leading to the problem. So this is what leftism does. It has to maintain these groups. It has to maintain these groups of others who then are used as a rationale for their own programs. It's unbelievable that they get away with it, and that people could live in LA or San Francisco, which I have been in recently,
Okay.
and continue to vote for the people that they do, despite the results of their programs and their politics. It's stunning.
It is.
But they buy into this bleeding heart leftism. But the thing is, these politicians just use these contingents as a vehicle for perpetuating their own schemes, which are statist. So what do the politicians get out of it? It accrues power to the state and gives these politicos more power, more funds to distribute, more programs to perpetrate, and more authority and authoritarianism over the population. Recently, I think it was in L.A., the new mayor of L.A. just gave herself power to rescind the property rights of property owners under cases of emergency where the homeless are concerned. So This is just unbelievably authoritarian.
Right. And I think they're going to push it as far as they can until they actually get pushback, because the rules, the laws as written on paper are, they only mean as much as our willingness to enforce them, essentially.
Absolutely. And property rights are essential to a free society. And they're pushing various communistic schemes through various legislation. And, basically communism gives great power to the ruling political class.
Absolutely.
And robs it of the citizenry. And that's what they're up to. And they also are perpetrating what has been called anarcho-tyranny. And that is, they let all kinds of criminal behavior go on to ravage the communities and reduce them to a kind of primitive anarchy on the streets, while they then harass and tax to death and attack basically any middle or upper middle class people, but mostly the middling class, and reduce their property holdings, reduce their rights, and effectively subject them to this anarchy on the street of criminals running rampant. And
Absolutely.
so it's a strange amalgam of anarchy and authoritarianism at the same time. Anarcho-tyranny, I think, best describes it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know it's really interesting. You go back and read some of that Sam Francis in that essay. It's a fascinating essay. I know he's a very polarizing figure, but that really is, I think, a very apt way to describe it, Michael. What we went through, our little cultural revolution of 2020 in the summer of George, watching mothers in Idaho literally get arrested on playgrounds, when they were just there exercising their basic rights as a human, as a parent, watching them peacefully get arrested while, left-wing groups were terrorizing, robbing, beating, and killing with impunity in all of our nation's large cities, virtually. Yeah,
absolutely.
That was the tale of 2020. Let me shift gears a little bit, because I wanted to devote a few minutes, a little bit of time, certainly to some of your other work and great writings on, and I'll broadly lump it in as kind of the ESG, the Great Reset movement. I know the World Economic Forum is a piece of that, and there are certainly different factions within this broad movement. But with ESG scores and how do those fit into the Great Reset, broadly speaking, and I'll give you the floor here, where are we headed with this moving into the future? I know there's been some pushback on this Great Reset idea or the ESG investing. Now I think companies are pulling back. Where do you think we sit now and into the next 2, 3, 4 years with this broad movement?
Yeah, I mean, the ESG, the Environmental, Social, and Governance Index, is a way of circumventing all procedural, so-called democratic processes and running a backdoor economic intervention to, of course, trammel and utterly control all production and industry and business altogether. And it's forming what I call a woke cartel. And that's a large cartel of those who abide. And then the aim is to starve off the non-woke from all capital investment. That's clearly what's going on. And so it's a monopoly scheme. It's a shared monopoly scheme on the part of these woke cartel members, led by, at the top of the financial pyramid, as far as we know, by people like Larry Fink and other CEOs of these groups. Although I think Vanguard is pulling back a little bit from the ESG.
Right.
And there's been a lot of pushback by governors in the United States. And I think perhaps there'll be some legislative pushback at the national level, because they could bring this up into an antitrust legislation. It's possible, but probably not very easy to do. I think the ESG is going to. It's facing some. Thankfully, it's facing some serious resistance now.
Yes.
And but left on it to its own devices, it would utterly destroy the economy. Not only adding tremendous expense to all of production and consumption, and distribution and so on and so forth, but basically gutting the industrial capacities of the West, while bribing the third world through wealth transfers, basically not to develop. Basically, this is what the UN does vis-a-vis and in conjunction with the World Economic Forum now, is to effectively bribe the third world through these through these recommended wealth transfers, which Biden has already, committed funds to paying off these developing nations for the so-called damages of climate change. So this is an international socialist movement, but I have to caveat that by saying that it leads to actually existing socialism, which is what socialism always becomes, which is some sort of ruling oligarchy with control over all resources and production at the top, and a kind of subsisting, actually existing socialism on the ground, where you have this leveling of the population into economic equality, which economic equality means completely reduced standards of living and reduced prospects and lack of social and economic mobility, and a complete, neo-feudalistic setup. But they're using climate change as the pretext for undertaking this, and it's nothing but a pretext. There's no basis for it. Right. And, I think that we're going to be in for a battle with this. They'll sneak it around anything they can get it into, this ESG, and the states are starting to push back, saying we're not investing our pension funds in this ESG-inflected nonsense, because this is not geared toward the best output. This is not geared towards shareholders' interests at all.
Right.
So we're going to see some basic battling over this, and I think it's necessary to put the question of climate change on the table. The so-called science of climate change must be adjudicated publicly by somebody significant. It's not going to be Elon Musk, because his EVs are kind of hinging on the whole narrative. And it won't be, I don't know who it will be, but it has to be somebody major. And then, of course, we need our public intellectuals to finally declare this the hoax that it is, and to undermine the scientific pretext under which this is being conducted.
Absolutely. And I agree. It has to be someone prominent or a group of prominent folks. Yeah. Elon Musk, I appreciate what he's doing with Twitter. I won't go so far as to call him controlled opposition, but yeah, you're absolutely right. He's been on the vanguard of pushing a lot of this environmental stuff that has led to some of these awful, it's led to some of these awful policies. And of course, he's been on the receiving end of huge and generous taxpayer subsidies as well.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, we've got to think about, does he have entirely pure motives, and who does he owe, that sort of thing.
Right.
I was going to ask you too, and this plays right off of what you were just talking about. Traditionally, those on the so-called right and conservatives here in the U.S. have always railed against the creeping socialism. And of course, I think there was a big element to that, 80 years ago, 70 years ago, coming out of the New Deal. There were all the Works Progress Administration, the alphabet soup agencies, which were kind of a meld, I think, of socialistic, policies, many of which inspired Stalin or were inspired by Stalin, back and forth. But I think, and it sounds like your work is uncovering this more and more and fleshing it out, but in the United States now, it's seeming to me that we don't just have a big, quote, socialist bogeyman. It's more of this corporatism, or an economic element of fascism that we absolutely strongly have. And I think the Twitter files, tell me what you think about this, but, we've been seeing the Twitter files dumps over the past 2 weeks, and they seem to just be strong evidence showing that, well, the federal government, it might not own the means of production. It might not actually own Twitter or Facebook, but essentially they own Mark Zuckerberg or they own Jack Dorsey, right?
Yes. I wrote
it seems very fascistic to me, where all can be funneled through the state for everything for the state. The corporations work for the state. The oligarchs work for the state. How do you see that?
Yeah, that's true. I think, and I call it corporate socialism. It's also economic fascism.
Yeah.
It's everything for the state, everything with nothing outside the state. But it also benefits these corporations because they become preferred producers and preferred media outlets and preferred social media outlets, and they gain, effective immunity from particular legislative sanctions, but also they gain, essentially what they gain is de facto monopoly status.
Yes.
And so this is really why I call it corporate socialism. It's corporate oligarchs and the state in conjunction on top with an actually existing socialism underneath.
Yes.
For the vast majority. And there's an unholy alliance between these corporations and the state, big tech being the most significant purveyor and the most important element of it, because it's the communications and ideological apparatus of the whole regime. That's why big tech has been the leading edge. This is what I argued in Google Archipelago. They're the leading edge of this new corporate socialist regime. They control the message. They control the information. They control the ideology. They control the narratives. And so this breach at Twitter represents a shakeup in that Googleplex, if you will. And, this is why you see the left freaking out hysterically about this, not just the minions, but also, in the upper echelons in the state, the Biden administration, all of the state agents and agencies and so on, they are losing perhaps control of one of their primary state apparatuses.
Yes.
And that's the reason there's this great deal of commotion and histrionics with reference to this.
Histrionics. I love that term, because you might have seen, you probably don't read them, you might have seen some of these articles maybe flash across your phone or what have you. I've seen some from Vox, maybe Huffington Post, where they're freaking out, like the article or, the clickbait headline will be something like, "Why are all tech companies right-wing now?" And I'm like, just chuckling to myself, like, oh my gosh, you guys lose Twitter, and then all of a sudden the world is crashing down upon them. It's
right.
hilarious.
The whole big digital complex has been leftist and totalitarian for a long time. And likewise, they see this potential loss as, everything turning right wing. It's just one outlet that has basically shaken the woke cartel up, and perhaps, representing a break in the woke social media cartel regime. So, yeah, I mean, they're absurd that they would suggest that the social media is all right wing, when the whole of media and all the social media, except for Twitter, I guess to some extent, although I'm not completely convinced that it'll be a free speech platform entirely. All of the major networks and all of the major media are all leftist and totalitarian. Yeah. I mean, all of a sudden, one slight breach in the chain, and they're calling it all right wing. It's hilarious.
It is. And so what are they going to do? I mean, I guess, it's an open question. We're going to find out. We're going to collect the data and kind of run this experiment. But how do they deal with this breach, as you called it? I like that way of describing it. Do they just totally all out attack Elon Musk? And we've seen a little bit of that happening. I mean, all of a sudden, are there going to be like reported crimes? Are they going to hashtag Me Too Elon Musk? How are they going to deal with this this dissenter? I mean, do they abandon Twitter?
Yeah, there'll be character assassination plots, and there'll be other types of campaigns to discredit and destroy him. But also, what we're going to see is a doubling and tripling down on the part of these other social media and information platforms, Google, Facebook, Instagram, etc.
Yeah,
to basically regroup and circle the wagons around their woke cartel, trying to isolate Twitter and perhaps discredit Musk and effectively banish it as a tool, or they'll try to recuperate it. It's possible they'll try to recuperate it, but I don't see how they're going to when he has complete ownership without any shareholders. So it becomes pretty hard to control their policies from the outside, although there's pressure groups, and those include not only the ADL, but also the European Union and their Digital Services Act. They're going to try to impose European digital regulations on all social media, and those are very, very narrow and strict. They outlaw hate speech and so-called disinformation, and that could be anything, as we know. So there's going to be a lot of pressure put on Twitter.
Yeah, it seems like they're going to need to either kind of abandon it or destroy it. I don't think they can let it exist as it is right now.
Right.
And I agree with you spot on about the so-called environmental movement of global warming / climate change. I think that has been, there might be some true believers there, maybe 30, 40 years ago. I think the so-called modern left is masterful at co-opting these movements and absolutely putting them into the employment for their goals. And I think to that end, also the COVID-19, all the authoritarianism and the tyranny that we've seen in the past 2.5 to 3 years, I think they've been masterful with that as well. Because I go onto Instagram, and anything that mentions COVID or injection or vaccine, it gets a label instantly, I guess, with AI or some other technology.
AI.
Is that something? Yeah, it's got to be AI, right? That's something that's already being used here in the United States, right? Identification of outlawed speech, dangerous speech, disapproved speech.
Oh, yeah, big time. And, we see that the FBI has been involved. And of course, the Department of Homeland Security has backdoor portals to Facebook and Instagram, and we'll probably find out also effective portals to Twitter that were there. And that they used to screw down speech that they didn't want, disruptive speech to the narrative about COVID. If it weren't for catastrophes, the left would have nothing really.
Yeah, that's
they
right.
use catastrophism as a way to bring about their agenda. So they need these catastrophes, and they must not be violated narratively, if you will.
Absolutely right. Yeah, because we live in a country, as you've noted before, as many other great authors have noted, where you can drive up to your parking lot at work and you're walking in checking the same iPhone that your boss has. Maybe you're driving the same vehicle that your boss has. You're wearing the same clothes. You both have air conditioning. It's very hard, I think, to upset or to overturn, to create chaos in a society like that, unless you have these manufactured crises, I think, in my opinion. I would agree with your general sentiments.
Absolutely. With the free market, and I won't call it capitalism because that's been an epithet since its inception, that term. With the free market and, the kinds of free enterprise that has spurred economic growth in the United States and elsewhere, but here, let's stick to here. There becomes really no economic pretext for overthrowing it, except for the keeping of certain welfare a welfare state that keeps a certain class of people in their thrall and keeps them poor and keeps them relatively poor, that is, compared to others. They don't really have the economic lever that they had, early in the 20th century.
Yes.
So they have to use these other things to control and strip the population of wealth.
Yeah, and I think when you go back and I'm sure you're much more deeply read in a lot of these texts, but even reading, just Communist Manifesto or Das Kapital, it's just also dated. Like owning the means of production, as if everything's made in a factory. It's so 1860 or 1850, right? Nowadays, it's like everyone jumps online. Like, I've started up this new podcast. What are the means of production? I'm using the Riverside software, for example. People start websites. They start businesses in their own homes selling stuff that their kids make, crafts. So it's hilarious when I go back and I read these primary, very basic texts of Marxism. And everything is like worker and factory and smokestacks. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is so historically just dated. It's just tired, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the premise of Marxism really was that there'd be this continual immiseration of the working class, that they would be driven to more and more dire poverty, and that really all they would get out of work would be the means of subsistence and nothing else. And they would be tied and tethered to the factory and have no way out, and they would be reduced to the lowest possible wage that could be paid. And all of this was proven to be false. It's all been historically, empirically proven to be complete bunk. Nothing of the sort ever happened, and therefore they have to try other means.
Yes, absolutely. Quickly before we go, one last topic here, kind of related, but central bank digital currencies. Mm-hmm. What do we need to, I think a lot of us are loosely aware that this could be coming down the pike. The Fed's got to be cooperating with the federal government to kind of look at this. I think they're aware of it. I think they want to employ it. But is this something that is going to be also using private industry, private companies? As it seems like always tyranny comes to the U.S. that way. Or what should we be looking out for, and what do you see coming in the next few years on this front here in the U.S.?
Well, CBDCs, but also digital identity, which they need in order to run the CBDC. So that'll come through corporations largely. They're encouraging basically carbon footprint tracking through attachments to credit cards and other digital identity features that are starting to be rolled out. And CBDCs will be coming out of the Fed if it comes out. And likewise, of course, that means total state surveillance over spending, savings, and debt. Yes. And that means complete control. of all transactions, mostly, all transactions that are using CBDC, and they may make other types of transactions verboten or outlawed. So it is a very significant threat. It's the closing of the digital gulag circle, if you will. If these two elements come into play, digital identity and CBDC, you're going to be basically, there'll be no way out of the digital gulag, really. And this will make it impossible to be a dissident of any kind.
Yeah.
You'll be destroyed. Right. It'll make at some point the digital gulag is going to turn into more than just a virtual one, and it's already for many people, because once you're banned that way, it has real world implications. But this would really close the circle on that. And likewise, I've suggested that we absolutely reject and refuse these technologies. CBDC and digital identity and other elements of the fourth industrial revolution, as it's called.
Yeah, and I think to put this into effect, it seems to me, my analysis is that they're going to have to crack down on mainstream cryptocurrencies. I don't want them to. I support the freedom. I support individual transactions. There's my disclaimer, of course. But the way I see it, and I don't know your thoughts on this, they're going to have to outlaw Bitcoin. That could just come down. I could see that in the next Biden term, God forbid. That could be in the next 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, this could be a function of this FTX failure, and that they've let these certain unsavory players, Sam Banks. Fraud, or whatever you want to call it, Banksman fraud, I call them.
Yeah, right.
That they let this stuff go out of control in order to justify and have a rationale and a pretext for controlling, if not outlawing, any kind of digital currency that's not CBDC.
Right.
They're going to use this to regulate it out of existence or to regulate it into the CBDC, something like that.
Well, and that's fascinating. I don't know if this is where you were going, but I kind of just tinfoil had it out just a second ago. But is there some chance that this whole thing was orchestrated intentionally? Or is that what you were kind of intimating, that this thing,
it's just
he's so tied up with the left. Could they have done this on purpose, crashed it, and then so they could say, hey, look, this crisis, now we have to come in and regulate it. We have to do it for you, the people. We have to protect you.
Yeah, this comes back to the same question that I face all the time. If they didn't engineer it, they certainly are going to use it to their benefit. So they may have let it happen on purpose, so that then they could use it as a pretext for this kind of draconian legislation that I think is it was forecast in Biden's executive order, the same one in which he advanced the idea that we, really should get into central bank digital currency.
Yes.
So this serves as a perfect case scenario that they could use for this purpose. And whether they, I don't know that it's engineered. I think this guy Bankman Fraud, is sitting in jail right now. So if they did engineer it, he certainly looks to be a patsy at this point.
He's a patsy.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and I guess in the meantime, what we can do is buy gold, silver, maybe some platinum, take care of your finances and get out of debt. I don't have any. That's
for sure. Even though there is precedent in the United States for confiscating gold.
That's right.
And forcing people to trade it in for whatever currency they want. So
happened under FDR, right? They confiscated a bunch of the gold.
They confiscated a lot of gold, all that they could get. So this is not unheard of. So
the good news, at least, is that I lost a lot of my gold on fishing trips. So they're in the bottom of lakes and whatnot. It's very unfortunate. But,
very good.
Yeah,
very good.
Yeah.
That's where a lot of it should remain until needed.
Deep underwater at the bottom of a lake.
Exactly.
Michael, I really appreciate you making the time to talk about these, this smattering of ideas. Really enjoy reading your work over at Mises. And then also, I think at your website, right? michaelrectenwald.com.
Right. That's where I keep everything, even the Mises articles and other articles that I write. And all of my books are available through my website. You can order directly from me and avoid Amazon if you wish, and I'll send signed copies out.
Very good. Love that. So go visit michaelrectenwald.com and make sure to check out and purchase some of Michael's books. Absolutely. I've read a few of them and I plan to read more. But Michael, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it today, and wish you happy holidays.
You too. Happy holidays to you, and thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
This has been the California Liberty Project podcast. Make sure to subscribe, share it with others, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter.